And thank you for the opportunity to be with you at this conference. I now figured out that I didn't actually collude with Clive, but some of my presentation is going to have a bit of Clive in it. And I'm now doing quite a good run with Nick, because everywhere he goes, I go, and I'm always second to his presentation as well. And I hope that there's a bit of synergy in it. So I'm going to, as Paul kind of indicated, cover where we've come to in civil defence per se, talk a little bit about Christchurch, but I'm trying to avoid the conversation being dominated by Christchurch, and then finish with some priorities and issues which I think we are due to address to make sure that we're better prepared to tackle the next one, wherever that may be. So, yes, our year has been dominated by Christchurch and Canterbury in the civil defence field, and there are a whole raft of implications which are going to come out of the lessons learning process, and including formal reviews and the Royal Commission. What I'm going to give you this morning, though, is a bit more about a bit like the two previous presentations. This is John Hamilton's view. This is not the result of the formal reviews, and it's certainly not going to go anywhere near where a Royal Commission might go. But so if you are thinking about it in terms of these are the initial observations, primarily from my role as National Controller in Christchurch, but also as Director, and taking into account both Christchurch and where we currently are in civil defence. So it's been quite difficult for me to get out and about and to talk to the groups, and particularly those groups who have had quite significant changes in the way that they operate, largely because of being tied up with Christchurch for what seemed like half the year, even though it wasn't, and really the challenge of getting back into so-called normal life. For those groups that I have visited and talked to, including those in Christchurch, I have tended to take a copy of the Act along and wave the copy of the Act and point to a couple of sections in them, which Clive started his presentation on, which was about the obligations and the responsibilities, the legal obligations that civil defence emergency management groups have for doing civil defence emergency management stuff for their communities. Now, I'm not sure how successful my scare tactic of waving the Act at them was. I suspect that it wasn't actually that good. But it was an effort to try and get mayors and chief executives and members of the Joint Committee or the coordinating executive group to truly understand that there are some real responsibilities here, and we need people to take them on board. I'm going to take now a slightly different stance to all this and use what I think is a softer approach. And rather than wave around the legislation, ask people the question, get the people who are in these senior positions to think about how well placed they are as an organisation. It doesn't have to be just civil defence, you can apply this to other partner organisations as well. How well placed is your group, your organisation, to be able to deal with the sorts of things that Christchurch had to deal with? And it's not a simple yes no answer. And to help couch some of the answers, I think there's a list of questions. And when you think about them, put yourself in the place of Peter Whittle, Gary Knowles, John Hamilton, Bob Parker, Minister Carter, Minister whichever, and think about how they're going to be able to perform based on the support and the skill sets that should be residing in the organisation. So these are the sort of questions I think that kind of fall out of that. Are we confident that the controllers that you as a civil defence group have appointed to run one of these operations, do you think they can handle it? Will they have sufficient information drawn out of your organisation to enable them to make good decisions? Are the internal management and decision-making processes within the group as a whole, but in the response mode in the EOC or the ECC, are they robust enough and effective? Do we have the right mechanisms for communicating with the public and the media? And that was a theme that came out in Nick's presentation, and I'm going to dwell on a little bit further. Have we really sorted out the role of the mayor versus the controller? And I think there's a couple of very good lessons around about the role of the mayor in some of these crises. How effective is the relationship with our partner agencies in our particular area? Do we truly cooperate? Do we truly trust each other for information being passed on and for actions that would expect to be taken place? So those questions tend to be response-focused, largely because of the proximity of and the visibility of the response mode because of Christchurch. But I know there are also questions we can ask ourselves in the other, I'll get my fingers right, in the other sides of the R's and the readiness and risk reduction as well. And so, again, does the group really integrate risk reduction initiatives into its general planning, and especially land use planning across councils? Or are we paying lip service to the consideration of civil defence emergency management risks in our land use planning? How effective is our public awareness program in our communities themselves? Is the community properly prepared for the most likely scenario that your group faces? Does the group and its members really engage with the community on civil defence emergency management issues to get the community to understand the hazards and risks they face and get them to work with the councils to get better prepared and to initiate response planning? And what have we done about the resilience of the critical infrastructure in our particular area? You can kind of go on with a series of these questions, but my point here is that these are the sorts of questions I think we should be asking ourselves to gauge how well our groups are performing and how well individual components of each group are functioning. It's not about whether the bit of the Act that says you are to do something is being complied with. It's much more about getting us to understand and take on the responsibility we have as community leaders and as practitioners in civil defence emergency management, the operational level, for ensuring that we are well prepared and able to manage the risks that our communities face. So as I look back on the last couple of years, I think that civil defence emergency management in this country has matured, and I am confident in saying that for a number of reasons. The first one is that our overall civil defence and emergency management arrangements have now been tested under fire, using the Christchurch scenario, and in very general sense they have worked well. Second, all our groups have now completed the monitoring and evaluation process, and while the reports have not always been adopted by groups without some sort of debate or pushback, I think they have now provided us with a pretty good summary of where each group sits, and they certainly indicate to both the Ministry as well as groups where improvements are necessary. And the third one is that civil defence and emergency management currently enjoys a pretty high degree of visibility, if not status, certainly in the public's mind, and there is a good deal of confidence and goodwill, confidence in our abilities and goodwill towards the organisation. And we should use that to our advantage in central government as well as local government to continue to promote readiness and to make sure that in fact our organisation is as ready as the public expect it to be. I know on the other side of the ledger it can still be argued that perhaps the resources are a bit thin on the ground in many groups, and that there remains a bit of a risk around the she'll be right attitude that communities have to preparedness. But it's certainly not all doom and gloom, and I think we can be proud of the progress that we have made in civil defence and emergency management. If I look at the Ministry of Civil Defence and Emergency Management first, These are the areas in which I think we've made some solid progress over the last few years. I think as a ministry we now have a far better understanding of the sector and how it operates, and that has been assisted greatly by the monitoring and evaluation program. I think we in the ministry have strengthened the relationship between the ministry and you people, the groups, mainly through the regional emergency management advisors, but supported also by the improved guidance that the ministry has made available. Our relationship with other national agencies and international partners is stronger now than it ever has been in the few years ago. We have introduced a number of new approaches, including the Resilience Fund and the way that operates, the monitoring and evaluation process, which I've talked about. We've adjusted the way that some group offices work, and we've used the development needs analysis and rolled out EMIS to help groups in their work in their communities. The ministry has enjoyed some very high degree of stability in the workforce, in the ministry staff, which has resulted in increased experience and better contacts and better understandings with the groups and EMOs. And lastly, I'm going to take this opportunity to express how pleased I was and how impressed I have been by the high personal commitment shown not by just the Ministry of Civil Defence staff during the Christchurch earthquake, but also by the large numbers of people who were deployed to Christchurch to assist in the response centre. The level of willingness and the skills that came to the party helped demonstrate the overall effectiveness of not only the NCMC but the whole Civil Defence emergency management arrangements. And I thank those groups that provided staff and supported the operation in Christchurch and my role. So I will now go into the second part of the brief, which is to look at some of the lessons that I've drawn out of the response in Christchurch. And from that I'm going to indicate where I think there is potential for making some adjustments to the way that we operate. As I said, I'm doing this from a personal point of view, and it comes from what I observed as in my period as National Controller down there, and I'm going to steer clear of anything that the Royal Commission might be investigating. The initial response to the earthquake on the 22nd of February was the responsibility of the City Council in Christchurch, which of course is in accordance with our civil defence arrangements. That official response, though, was hugely supported and assisted by the initiative, the courage and the energy and the selfless dedication by a whole raft of citizens, many of whom we will simply not be able to identify. And of course they were on the ground and supported by the emergency services, including the availability of a large number of NZDF personnel who were in the Canterbury region preparing for an exercise. In Wellington, it was quickly obvious from the reports that were coming in that many lives had been lost, that damage to buildings was widespread in the downtown area, and that liquefaction was extensive out in the eastern suburbs and that critical services were out of action. The National Crisis Management Centre in the basement of the Beehive was activated quickly after the initial report of the shake, and it swung into action to coordinate international assistance and the activities of other government departments. There was no doubt at the senior levels in Wellington that this was the big one and that local resources available in Christchurch were likely to be overwhelmed. So by 10:30 on the following day, on the Wednesday, the Minister declared the state of national emergency, using that provision in the Act that centralises control and coordination of the response operation in the appointment of the National Controller. And so, as National Controller, I then deployed to Christchurch to run the operation, using staff drawn primarily from the City Council and other councils in Christchurch, in the Canterbury region, as well as the emergency services, defence and a huge number of volunteers. The state of national emergency remained in place until the end of April, when the response was officially handed over to the newly established Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority. This was the first time New Zealand had ever used the National Declaration provisions in the Act. In truth, we had not practiced it, and we had not really thought out how we might run it from a centre other than Wellington. But having said that, going to Christchurch was the only way it could have run, and to try and run it remotely from Wellington would have gone right up the nose of the Christchurch people and sent entirely the wrong message. Setting the operational priorities was pretty easy and largely self-evident. The first phase was always going to be about rescuing those trapped and to provide them with the medical and casualty assistance that they would need, while we also tried to get essential services of food, water and shelter to the residents who were affected by the quake. The second phase commenced around day 10. Now I say about because I've never really gone back through my notes to figure out when it was. And that was when the urban search and rescue effort switched from looking for people who were still alive in the debris to the task of recovering the bodies of the deceased from the collapsed buildings, while at the same time effort was again put into assessing and meeting the needs of the people out in the residential areas. Phase 3 commenced around the end of March and focused on the well-being of the community itself and tried to get some economic activities restored, not particularly successful in my version, and we prepared for the transition to the full-blown recovery phase. That's caught me out, never mind. I'll leave it on there then. As you know, 181 people lost their lives, and the majority of those were in the collapse of the two buildings, the PGC and the CTV building. Initially, the rescue operations were undertaken by a combination of the emergency services that were on the scene, and as I said, a lot of people who used their initiative and courage to help out. Our national urban search and rescue capacity was bolstered by the arrival of international teams from the US, the UK, China, Japan, Singapore and Australia. And if you ever wanted an advertisement for international standardisation and the values of it, this is it. These teams were selected because they were all held UN accreditation in urban search and rescue, which meant we knew what they were capable of. We knew that they would come self-sufficient for at least the first 3 days. We knew that they would behave in accordance with the UN protocol and that there wouldn't be any pushing and shoving about command and control. And as a consequence, we've been told since by particularly the US team that it was one of the best run operations that they'd ever attended. Meanwhile, out in the suburbs, work was underway to assess the needs and provide welfare services and to restore essential services, including the transport network, electricity, water and sewerage. And in reality, there was never ever going to be enough of the resources available to us to meet everybody's requirements, whether it was water purification, generators or toilets. And the logistics task was huge. We basically captured the market in Portaloos in New Zealand, and in addition acquired another 1,000 Portaloos flown in from the US at great expense, and over 30,000 chemical toilets manufactured by a little man in China. It was tough for residents. It was particularly tough trying to satisfy the demand for services. But if anybody's thinking of going camping this Christmas holidays, I can do you a good deal in chemical loos. Something's happened here. I've skipped a couple of slides. So let me try and highlight some of the lessons that I've drawn from this experience. And I'm going to start with the very operational and come back to these ones at the higher level. I think if you've gathered, if there's a common theme between Clive's presentation and Nick's presentation and mine, situational awareness becomes paramount to your ability to manage a large-scale operation. And it probably shouldn't be as a surprise to us. But in Christchurch, we were hampered by difficulties in establishing an information management system inside the ECC and the art gallery. We were hampered in gathering and actually displaying the data, primarily because the usual council systems were not available, and we were having difficulty reporting in on reconnaissance tasks that had been completed. It was a real challenge to be able to provide one consolidated picture of the impact in its many layers of detail of what had happened in the whole area. And I think it could be argued that the resources were available, but it was difficult to use them and present the information in a timely and clear enough manner for decisions and plans to be undertaken. And I'm hoping that EMIS will help out in the future, but we need to, I think, look at the whole process about how we achieve situational awareness. As a follow-on from situational awareness, even if we did have a picture of the impact of the earthquake, the question was whether we had the ability to task and manage the use of the resources that were available to us. And in the short term, we do that quite well. But I've concluded that we are not very good in civil defence at doing deliberate operational planning. And that is the longer term thinking about what might happen when the resource and what resources are likely to be able to manage the situation well downstream. Now, I was lucky to be able to steal a couple of retired Army officers from Christchurch to oversee the planning function and try and put a little bit of more rigour and a self-discipline around the planning process. I wouldn't advocate trying to use the full military appreciation process for civil defence. It's far too cumbersome. And I think, though, that we need to have a simpler planning guideline which helps translate the picture to the decision makers and helps convey the decision that is made into action plans and specific coordinated tasks. We've touched on the role of the media, and in Christchurch it played a very important role. But she's a hungry beast. It demands to be fed, as Nick has illustrated, and it demands to be fed frequently and preferably by the hands of the senior keeper. And if you don't feed it, it goes away and finds its own material, and sometimes what it finds is not going to be particularly pleasant to you. So feeding the media becomes a very important part of the role of the controller to make sure that, in my case, my personal goal of assuring the key stakeholders, the residents of Christchurch, the government, the public of New Zealand and some of our international partners, that we actually had the situation under control. And to back up Nick's comment for Peter Whittle, dealing with the media takes up a huge amount of time and a huge amount of emotional energy, and it takes you away from looking at the operation and thinking about the operation and where it might be going next. But having said that, the media are also a valuable source of intel in civil defence emergency management, and it is a way of checking that the approach to the response that you've adopted is in fact working. But you have to be very careful not to be sucked into the trap of believing that what the television cameras are showing you and the rest of the country is the situation. TV coverage can be very restricted and narrow in its focus, and the controller and those monitoring the operation need to be looking far broader and wider than what the TV cameras are doing. Inevitably, the question of the use of social media comes up in civil defence and emergency management. Normally this would be where I'd show my age, but I've already described my computer literacy and my connection with computers this morning. So I don't do Facebook and I don't do Twitter and I have trouble with a computer. But the public expectation is that we will engage with them by those social medias. And if we don't, we'll get accused of being out of touch and failing to communicate with them. Next time, there will be an expectation that we are active as emergency management people in the social media, not just to provide information about the crisis itself, but to answer questions and, probably more importantly, to counter misinformation. This is going to take a lot more horsepower and a lot more practice, which most of us have not yet done. And so we must be ready to do it next time. As an aside, I think the use of social media in the arena grounding is now working quite well. It started off in the same position that I faced in Christchurch. There was a large volume of traffic going around the social media, most of it with a negative tone to the authorities that were in charge. But there was little engagement in that social media conversation by the authorities itself. Now it is being used quite well to inform communities and to marshal volunteers for the beach clean-up, and that indicates that with a bit of effort you can make social media work for you. So to finish this bit on the media and communications with the public, at the beginning of the emergency, the conversation with the public has to be very directive. It has to be, this is what the situation is, this is what I want you to do, this is what we will tell you when we can. But as the situation develops and the urgency diminishes, the tone should also change so that the conversation is much more two-way. But I don't think we did that very well, the second part of it. I don't think we did the two-way engagement with the community in Christchurch very well, and that is something which I think we can improve on. So a couple more of the operational issues. The first is business continuity, and the second is a comment on leadership. I think, from my experience in Christchurch, there are too many commercial concerns, largely in the small to medium-sized enterprise game, who have paid lip service to proper business continuity planning. The big utilities and service providers performed well in Christchurch, and here I could cite Transpower, Airways, the airport and the port company, the health board, the telcos, Orion Electricity, Fulton Hogan and a whole bunch of others which we won't go through. But at the next level down, I was surprised and dismayed by the number who needed assistance to recover critical business information, including documents or computer hard drives from damaged buildings. And they needed that information, those systems, to enable them to continue to operate. From the emergency management point of view, we wanted them to resume business as soon as possible, even though they might be operating from someone's garage or backyard in a different location. But there has to be an onus on the business and the individuals to be better prepared. And indeed, there's an opportunity for us to illustrate the business advantage of having a good business continuity arrangement in place. And I think we need to and can do much more to place greater emphasis on business continuity and to help the smaller guys get better prepared. Turning now to the leadership styles. At some points in the response in Christchurch, I was accused of being dictatorial and authoritarian as a leader. I don't make too many apologies for that. First, because that's what I'm like in a crisis. And probably that's the way I've been trained. And second, I think it is the style which is appropriate in the early stages of a crisis where there is a need to get some order and confidence into the situation and distill out from what looks like chaos and a whole raft of uncoordinated activities. But that dictatorial style, if you like, cannot be used for the duration of the emergency. It needs to adjust to become a more consultative and a style which has greater compassion and empathy with the public. So, applying a bit of hindsight, two questions arise for me around these leadership styles. Can you, as an individual, identify when you need to adjust your style? And then, if you can, have you actually got the personal flexibility to adjust your style? And particularly when you're tired and the adrenaline has run out. So our experience in Christchurch in the response suggests considerable work that can be undertaken. So our monitoring and evaluation program has helped us indicate where individual groups might need to make some improvements, and then many improvements have been already instigated. And I congratulate those that have done the work, and here I'm thinking of the work that's been done in Auckland, Waikato, Bay of Plenty, Hawke's Bay, Wellington, Canterbury and Southland as examples of where they have adjusted the way that the group functions. So having made some significant enhancements to the way that groups operate, now is the time for the groups themselves to tackle some of the other aspects of their responsibilities. And while it is understandable that response has a very high profile at present, we must not forget about the other 3 R's and the developments that could take place in them. I think we can do much more in the delivery of welfare services in the response. The provision of welfare services to a community in the response, and importantly in the recovery as well, is the key to our success because it is about helping people. I think we need to lift the status of the welfare manager and the welfare function and enhance the capabilities of welfare managers to ensure that they have the ability to operate at the high end of the response scale and to lead in what is a very diverse but highly critical function. They need to be at the shoulder of the controller to coordinate activities, and we must try and professionalise the function. In a similar vein, I think we need to put much more emphasis on recovery. We have underemphasised the recovery process as a consequence, both in terms of a doctrine and our structures, and again, the status of the recovery manager in our civil defence arrangements. It is apparent now that not enough people understand the recovery framework itself, or even know of its existence. And the lack of status and horsepower of recovery managers makes it extremely hard for them to promote the importance of the process, let alone to actually deliver it on the day. We need to promote recovery and elevate the recovery manager's position so that they too are able to operate in a highly effective manner in, again, what is a critical function. And so to wrap up, the earthquake in Christchurch is not our first, and it will not be our last major disaster. In some respects we were lucky. The September shock had given the whole organisation a bit of practice, and it had heightened awareness in the community. And I am sure that had the February earthquake occurred in Wellington cold and not Christchurch, the results would have been much, much worse in every respect. But our response indicates that our arrangements for civil defence and emergency management in this country are effective, including our ability to operate at the national level. Many of our international partners have been impressed by the way we're able to bring in international assistance and slot it into existing structures. They have remarked on what they saw as an ability to coordinate operations at all levels, from the Prime Minister and Cabinet across national level government departments and agencies, right down to the actual response operations themselves. Many other disasters of this scale in other places do not look like Christchurch. But having said that, and with the benefit of some time to think about the response, it is clear to me that we have a number of areas in which we can make some improvements that will ensure we're better prepared and better able to handle the next one. So, to conclude then, I thank you and those who work with you for the fantastic contributions they have made to the development of the sector over the last few years and the enhancement of civil defence in your areas. And in particular, I thank you all for your support and help in the response in Christchurch. I think we've moved ahead a long way, and that is as a result of your efforts and the efforts of the groups and their staff. Of course, we'll never ever actually achieve the nirvana, the perfect condition, but it is worth our efforts to look further for improvements because we only are here to serve our communities. So thank you for the opportunity to join with you. Thank you for the opportunity to give you a bit of an update of where I see civil defence and emergency management and the issues we have to address from the Christchurch response, and I'm happy to take questions. If indeed there are any.
What you mentioned about you feeling recovery managers are under...
I think it's an internal issue for civil defence. I think we have unwittingly placed greater emphasis on response, ergo the controller, and we've placed less emphasis on recovery, and the recovery manager does not have the same status and sometimes doesn't have the same attributes that we put into a controller, and yet the function is probably just as critical as the response. So I think it's an internal issue. There's a few heads to be banged together, I suspect, but I don't think it's not hard to resolve. The Ministry will work through a series of projects to provide better guidance to the groups as to how you might think about and deploy your recovery manager, or recovery function, I suppose. I'll go through it this way. So the formal review is now commenced without any publicity because there's an election on Saturday. That will be conducted by Mr Ian McLean and David Oughton. Ian McLean has done a lot of work in the Ministry of Health for various tasks, and David Oughton is a retired Secretary of the Treasury, I think he was, and has also been involved in some civil defence emergency reviews before as well. So they've started. They won't report back. Final report won't be completed until about June next year. Meanwhile, there is work underway to think about this recovery function and whether we can graft onto the Civil Defence Act or create another bit of act which kind of looks like a generic SERA Act, so that you don't have to go through the rigmarole of trying to scratch something together, literally from scratch, when a recovery is mooted. So we want to have a piece of legislation which sits on the shelf to be activated by government when a recovery of that scale is necessary, and that will have all the sorts of authorities which at the moment reside largely with controllers in the response. The national plan is being reviewed as well, but we've put that on hold while we try and do these reviews. And if anything, I expect there to be some greater changes in the national plan arrangement rather than the Act itself. Largely the Act worked. Yes, you can go through and sort of cross some T's and dot some I's, but I don't think it's actually it's not worth our effort, and it probably wouldn't see the light of day in Parliament either at this stage. I think there's more pressing things. I don't think the Act is broken. Yeah, in a very general sense, all government departments have been asked to find savings in the order of somewhere between 5, 6, 7%, which on a small budget is still quite a large sum of money. So there are a number of ways that we're doing that in our particular little budget of just over $10 million. It's tough, and it forces us to prioritise efforts, and it is going to cut back on some programs, or, as I guess you are aware, us not fill some critical positions, but that's where we're forced. It's going to end up, I think, for us to manage it, it ends up with us having to reprioritise our work efforts and to better team the horsepower that's available to the topics which we desperately need to get finished. The Ministry tends to take on a hell of a lot of work and advance on a very broad front, slowly. And I think we've got the opportunity, we'll be forced to kind of focus our efforts much more and bring it down to a smaller number and try and knock them on the head and then move on. But, you know, even my list of things that I've talked about there, and I haven't talked about public alerting systems or text messages or, you know, on you go, tsunami buoys or whatever else Clive wanted. You know, those are all project stuff which takes horsepower. But sadly, they might also be a slightly lower priority now while we put our effort into some of the critical arrangements that I think deserve attention. Any more for any more? Cool. Thank you.